Hey friends, this should be our last edition of our Period 4 lectures and period and PowerPoints. Um, Today we are going to talk about the age of Jackson. That would be Andrew Jackson, 1924 to 1944. Such an interesting character in U.S. history, war hero, but also very much responsible for a lot of our actions against the Native Americans here in our country. Andrew Jackson also finds himself on our $20 bill, and I believe it is in action, in place to remove him from the $20 bill and replace him with Harriet Tubman. I think that passed. I'm going to have to double check that, but um, here's our buddy. This is who we'll be talking about today. So let's start with Jacksonian democracy. Under Jackson, we had universal male suffrage, which essentially means that all white males could vote and hold office. So you could vote regardless, if you were a male, regardless of your social class, the land that you owned, how much or how little land that you owned, or where you were on the socioeconomic ladder. This was a big deal because prior to, voting was limited to only those who had a significant place in our society. Under Andrew Jackson, we also saw party nominating conventions. In the 1830s, candidates were being nominated at nominating conventions, giving the common man a bit of say for who they wanted to be in the White House. We also see the popular election of the president. So the states adopted a more democratic method of choosing or allowing the voters to choose a state's slate of presidential electors. Also, we see the birth of a two-party system during this time period, and then we also see the rise of a third party. So even though there were two parties that were the most popular, this was a time when other parties were allowed to throw a candidate in the ring if they felt like doing so. During the Jacksonian era, there was a much higher number of state and local officials being elected into office. This gave voters more of a voice in their government. Campaigning also became a popular thing to do. People went out and stomped the campaigning grounds, or just stomped their local areas, trying to get people excited for voting, going out and getting your voice heard. We also see during this time period the spoils system. This is something Andrew Jackson was pretty well known for, notorious for, but this was essentially the practice of dispensing government jobs in return for party loyalty, particularly Democratic. Jackson did this often and without any shame. We see also a rotation in the office. He would limit people to 1 year in a position, so then he could give the job to another deserving Democrat, which would equal another vote for him in the long run. Okay, so the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the most different of all presidents that came before him. He was a symbol of a working class man and also a symbol of the emerging middle class. He wasn't one of our founding fathers. He wasn't a brilliant thinker, writer, politician. He was born on the frontier in a cabin, so born out west in a cabin, and he was famed for being an Indian fighter and a war hero during the Battle of New Orleans, which happened during the War of 1812. He had no college education. He really was a self-made man that was popular with about every social group in every section of the country. He opposed increased federal spending and, of course, national debt. He had a narrow view of powers of Congress. He vetoed more bills than any other president. I feel like there's some similarities to what's happening today, maybe. I don't know. You decide. We're going to talk about the Peggy Eaton affair in real life. I'd rather talk to you in real life about it and give you some of the yummy details. It's like drama for the 1800s in American history. Something that Jackson is notorious for was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. No laughing matter here. He sympathized with land-hungry white citizens, and he wanted to take over the land of the American Indian any of the land that they essentially were hanging on to. So he signed into federal law the Indian Removal Act, which forced the resettlement of many thousands of American Indians. He also established the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1936 in an effort to help resettle the tribes and the people. But most politicians, in fact, supported the policy of Indian removal, and therefore they weren't too keen on really helping them after. So it kind of obviously becomes a disaster for the Native Americans, but it's a good, a positive for the Americans because they're going to start moving out and settling that land. At the same time decimating an entire culture. Also going to talk to you about Worcester and Georgia, which is a Supreme Court case in which essentially a group of Native Americans take the federal government, or take the state of Georgia rather, to court. And you'll be very intrigued in how it turns out. Unfortunately, during this time period, we also see the Trail of Tears. I have a really nice documentary about this that we'll watch in class. This happens in the beginning of 1838. The U.S. Army forces 15,000 Cherokee Indians to leave Georgia. The hardships of the trail they were pushed out west, essentially to present-day Oklahoma, and it caused about 4,000 Cherokee deaths just on the way there. Very sad. We also see under Jackson the nullification crisis, in which Jackson favored states' rights but not disunion. In 1928, we'll see that the Supreme Court declared the Tariff of 1828 as unconstitutional. And doing this proved a theory had by Jackson's Vice President John C. Calhoun, which he called the nullification theory, that each state had their own right to decide whether to obey a federal law or to declare it null and void, which makes for interesting issues ahead of us. Switching gears a little bit when we talk about society, culture, and reform of this time period, very influential time period in terms of change. We're going to see women take more prominent role. We're going to see authors. We're going to see art come about, more art, influential art come about this time period, reforming education, the prison system, so on and so forth. So a lot's going on. So several historic reform movements began during the Jacksonian era and in the decades that follow. We call this the antebellum period. Reformers dedicated themselves to such causes as public schools, improving the treatment of the mentally ill, the sale of alcohol, equal rights for women, and of course, abolishing slavery, which becomes a huge issue in the North. During this time period, we see what is called the Second Great Awakening, which is essentially a religious movement. Mostly it's a reaction against rationalism, which is essentially the belief in human reason. It started at Yale University under Timothy Dwight and is carried out through a series of revivals around the country. Society, essentially, these people feel that society had gotten away from their reason of being here, and that they had become very materialistic, very greedy, and way too commercial. And they needed this religious movement to bring them back to reason, the focus of what they're doing. Continue being hardworking, continue to praise God, continue to allow church to be the center of your society. And also at this time period, we see the rise of a new religion, the Mormons, otherwise known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who was started by Joseph Smith in 1830. They really received a lot of persecution by other people's religions, and they left. They were originally in upstate New York, and they hit the road because they were really being threatened and didn't want to take it anymore. Can't blame them. Can't say that I blame them. And so they hit the road, and they ended up at the Great Salt Lake in Utah. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when I see you next time. Ooh, the stove is going. I'll be right back. Hold on. I've got cornbread in the oven. All right, transcendentalists. Also, this is a big movement that happens during this time period. This is a movement rather, that arose during the Second Great Awakening. This is a group of authors, essentially, who question the doctrines of established churches and business practices of the merchant class. They essentially argue for a way of thinking to discover one's inner self and looking for the essence of God in nature. They also challenged the materialism of American society and suggested that artistic suggestion was way more important than the pursuit of wealth. Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of these transcendentalists. Here's a quote by him, which maybe you've heard of before. "What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us." Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882. He's the best known transcendentalist. He's a very popular American speaker and author at the time. He expressed the individualistic and nationalistic spirit of Americans by urging them not to imitate European culture, but create a distinctive American culture. He argued for self-reliance, independent thinking, and primacy of spiritual matters over material ones. He also became a leading critic of slavery in the 1850s and a very big supporter of the Union during the during the Civil War. Losing it. And last but not least, Henry David Thoreau. Here he is right here. So Henry David Thoreau, 1817-1862, conducted a 2-year experiment in which he lived simply in a cabin in the woods outside of town. He used observations of nature to discover essential truths about life and the universe. On Walden Pond is the name of his one of his writings. And essentially, he was a pioneer ecologist and a conservationist. And here's a great quote: "The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it." Very deep. Next time I see you, we'll talk more in depth about some of these other reforms, treatment of the mentally ill, public schools, alcohol, and of course, equal rights for women. And our conversation about abolishing slavery will just be ongoing from now until the Civil War. So, all right. Well, that is period 4 summed up for you. I hope you enjoy the next couple days. I'm not sure when I'll see you again, but I hope it's soon. Take care. Bye-bye.